Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little different. A quiet, unsettling tale about a chemical rain that never stopped killing. The long, complicated history of Agent Orange. Forget the Hollywood versions of war. This isn't about dogfights and medals. It's about a slow, invisible violence that seeped into soil and bodies and outlived the headlines. The truth is, dropped into that sprayed landscape, you wouldn't just face an immediate threat. You'd step into consequences that could follow you and your children for generations. To live under that rain was to carry an inherited burden. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. In the dim, humming rooms where wartime chemistry learned to feed peacetime agriculture, two molecules first showed themselves as small and useful, and then as something else entirely. In laboratories in Britain and the United States in the '40s, chemists were impatient to turn the new power of synthetic organic chemistry toward an old problem, weeds. The answer came not as a single miraculous potion, but as a pair of close cousins, phenoxy herbicides that would be called in technical registers 2004 dichlorophenoxyacetic acid, 2004D, and 2004-5 trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, 2004-5T. They were elegant in their deceit. They mimic the plant hormone auxin so well that when a leaf took them in, it began to grow the wrong way. Twisted, uncontrolled, terminal. In the mixed light of a greenhouse, the effect looked almost artistic. A broadleaf plant overgrowing itself into collapse, a tree's canopy dropping rapidly into barren twig. In a fieldworker's ledger, the effect was practical and cheap. In a forester's toolbox, it was efficient. In an army staff room, it read as an operational possibility. 204D had been adopted quickly by farmers and weed controllers because it spared grasses while killing broadleaf plants, a feature that made it useful for lawns, cereal crops, and highways. 245T was later tailored to the harder task of defoliating shrubs and young woody growth. When these two were mixed half and half, they made a powerful cocktail, broad-spectrum defoliation across a range of tropical and temperate plants. When the Department of Defense asked for a label to keep track of stocks, it took its cue from the bright, practical marks painted on shipping drums and called the mixture Agent Orange, not a poetic choice so much as a cataloguing one. An orange band that would come, with terrible irony, to stand for the chemical's fate. The chemistry hides an obvious and an obscure cruelty. The obvious part is simple enough to explain to the drowsy listener. The phenoxy herbicides work by hijacking a plant's hormonal system, causing growth processes to run wild until the plant can no longer sustain itself. The obscure part is the accident of manufacture. 2045T required an intermediate trichlorophenol, and under certain temperatures and reaction conditions that intermediate could condense with itself to form a dioxin. That dioxin, 2378 tetrachlorodibenzo P-dioxin, abbreviated TCDD, is not merely an impure extra, it is the seed of a different sort of story. TCDD did not behave like weeds. It does not feed on light and water. It binds to proteins in animals and humans, lodges in fat, resists the tidy business of decomposition, and wakes up biological switches that were never meant to be flipped. It can be measured in tiny parts per trillion and still be the difference between cellular quiet and cellular chaos. It is slow to leave the ground and slow to leave a body, and that slowness wrote the first lines of the disaster to come. The formation of TCDD in 2,4,5-T synthesis was a known possibility to those who watched their reactors closely. It was a byproduct born of chemistry's impotence. Heat, time, and insufficient purification conspire to make dioxins. In industrial laboratories in the late 40s and 50s, there were reports and scattered studies noting chloracin, a disfiguring skin condition, among workers, and traces of dioxin-related pathology in factory populations. The phenomenon was not publicised in the way a public health emergency would be today. It was catalogued in internal reports, footnotes, and the cautious sentences of corporate memoranda. To a company selling crop duster solutions or roadside clearers, the problem could sit for a time as a manageable occupational hazard. To a military planner looking at foliage as a tactical obstacle, it was an abstraction in a ledger, harmful to be sure in concentrated industrial settings, but not, it was argued, a strategic problem for aerial-scale defoliation. Serendipity, too, must be counted among the authors of policy. The military did not invent the phenoxy herbicide, it found it. The transition from farm to front happened in stages that were both bureaucratic and banal. Field trials here, a recommendation there, a map shaded with places where ambushes found their cover. The US military began testing herbicides for use in Southeast Asia in the early 1960s. In 1962, the United States Air Force formalized a program that would be known as Operation Ranch Hand. C-133 aircraft were fitted with spray tanks and booms. Men and mechanics learned to calibrate nozzles for swath, width and dose, and the 55-gallon drums bearing the orange bands were loaded onto ships bound for ports in South Vietnam. The imagery is domestic and ordinary. Men in greasy overalls tightening straps, the rattle of a factory in Arkansas loading crates onto flatbed trucks, the smell of metal and solvent on an airbase at dawn. There was a kind of practical clarity to it, a problem of supply, a solution of chemistry, and that clarity would be the first lesson in how cheaply one can convert an agricultural technology into an instrument of war. If Agent Orange was born at the intersection of plant physiology and logistics, its industrial life was lived in the large, humming factories and in the government arsenals that mixed, barreled and shipped the stuff in the quantities a war demanded. The two active ingredients came from a chemical industry that had grown fat on post-war demand for pesticides, plastics and petrochemical derivatives. Firms that supplied municipal weed control and timber management could scale, and they were asked to scale. The names are familiar because their histories did not end in secrecy. Monsanto and Dow were among the companies that manufactured components for the herbicides the military purchased. The US Army's Pine Bluff Arsenal in Arkansas became the mixing and packaging center, where bulk ingredients were blended into the final cocktails and loaded for overseas shipment. There were other manufacturers and subcontractors around the country too, and a supply chain that ran from chlorination units and phenol stocks to packed drums in a warehouse stacked like a citadel of orange rings. The wartime demand reshaped the factories. Plants that had once produced a few thousand litres for agricultural markets were now operating on a scale measured in millions of gallons a year. Closed-loop laboratory care became the rhythms of continuous high-pressure chemical plants. Under those conditions, the variables that control dioxin formation were things managers watched in the margins. Reactor temperature, residence time, choice of solvent, the thoroughness of purification steps. Under pressure to meet contracts, engineers sometimes chose speed over slow refinement. Purification that in peacetime might have added expense and delay suddenly looked like an unnecessary friction. Quality control inspections were organised around specifications important to the purchaser: concentration of active ingredient, stability of the formulation, ease of handling, but not around parts per million traces of a byproduct whose full toxicity to humans and ecosystems had not yet been universally accepted or regulated. In short, the supply chain had a blind spot. Contracts reinforced the blind spot. The Department of Defense, intent on volume and timeliness, operated in a procurement environment where guaranteed buyers and large, cost-driven agreements favoured throughput. For the producers, there were incentives to fulfill orders quickly and cheaply. The Army had pipelines, warehouses, and a customer that paid. The firms had plants, engineers, and shareholders who expected returns. There was little in the standard contract language of the early 1960s that forced rigorous dioxin testing or required companies to prove an absence of certain byproducts. The result was a market in which the final formulation, Agent Orange, varied from batch to batch depending on where the 2,4,5-T had been made and how it had been processed. Some drums contained fractions of a toxic contaminant, others contained more. Lot numbers became important later, not because the Army cared in the moment, but because litigation and epidemiology would use those very stamps to trace exposure decades after the sprayers had returned to base. Logistics in war are both banal and immaterial. Barrels were painted, banded, and stacked on freighters bound for Cam Ranh Bay, Da Nang, Bien Hoa. At the airfield, supplies were assembled into loads for C-123s and retrofitted helicopters. Sometimes mixing was done close to the theatre to speed distribution. Storage facilities in South Vietnam, Bien Hoa Air Base, the depots at Da Nang and Cam Ranh, wore the orange drums like a new kind of ordnance. They were not explosives, but they were treated, in the choreography of war, as munitions to be deployed against terrain and crops. Pilots of the 12th Air Commando Squadron and the later 1st Air Commando units learned to fly low, to judge drift, to calibrate doses for a canopy measured in acres. A single flight might turn a swath of rainforest into bare branches, and the rustle of leaves that had sheltered movement and secrets turned into a brittle, dead silence. that silence was not complete or permanent. Tropical ecosystems regrow with a patience that irritates military plans. The fall of leaves over an acre did not translate into permanent denial. Young shoots would follow, guerrillas adapted. They dug tunnels, they moved in small units, they dispersed caches and crops. One of the ironies of the program was that tactical gains often demanded repeated applications. One spritz of a few thousand gallons did not buy a campaign. It bought a temporary clearing and the need for yet more product. In computational terms, the herbicide program was efficient at producing denuded ground. In human terms, it was blunt. In strategic terms, it was a wager that chemical means could substitute for social and political solutions. In practice, the gamble was determined not in a general staff room, but in the logistics and production demands that made more and more of the orange-striped drums necessary. Debates did occur inside the corridors of power, though they were often muffled by necessity and the taste for technical solutions. There were scientists who urged restraint. Arthur Galston, an American plant physiologist, became an early and eloquent critic. He had studied auxins and their effects, and he worried that weaponizing plant growth regulators would have consequences beyond the trees. He feared ecological cascades and unanticipated human harm. His objections were notable because he came from the same scientific house that produced the herbicides. He was not a political polemicist, but a cultivated voice arguing that the knowledge of biology should direct moral action. His protests found sympathy in whispers and resistance in the forward offices, where generals and secretaries counted sorties and acres. The legal argument offered by defense counsel bent on the Geneva Protocol's language. These were herbicides, not nerve agents. They were pesticides, and therefore a lawful tool against vegetation and crops. The moral argument that destroying subsistence crops could be indistinguishable from using chemical weapons against people dependent on those crops was harder to legislate away, but easier to sideline in the calculus of counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency doctrine provided the frame that made the herbicide look like strategy. American military thought in the 1950s and 1960s had been shaped by experiences in places like Malaya, where the problem of insurgency was sometimes approached through population control, relocation, and the denial of sanctuary. In Vietnam, the enemy's mobility, its use of the jungle, and the dependence on locally grown rice and cassava meant that an approach which denied cover and food would, in theory, degrade the insurgents' capacity to fight. Deny the jungle, deny the rice, make movement visible. These were the rubrics that appeared on maps and in staff memoranda. Robert McNamara, as Secretary of Defense in the Johnson administration, favoured technological and managerial fixes. He believed in measuring inputs and outputs and in solutions that could be quantified. To get at an enemy who melted into vegetation, the logic went, transform the vegetation into something that no longer hides or feeds. The practical decisions followed that logic. Spray patterns were made to clear landing zones and to keep the edges of supply roads visible. Perimeters around American and South Vietnamese bases were defoliated to reduce ambush risk. The borderlands and the Ho Chi Minh Trail were targeted in campaigns meant to disrupt infiltration routes. Ranch hand sorties penetrated Laos and Cambodia, at times when interdiction and covert operations sought sanctuary denial. The spray was applied not only from the air, but by trucks and backpacks, by military engineers and by contracted civilian teams. Tractors and skid loaders cleared borderlands, helicopters sprayed ravines. A map dotted with a orange swathe slowly became a ledger of tactical claims. Operational expediency had two consequences. One was scale. The more the spray seemed to work, the more the military asked for and received. Between 1962 and 1971, the US sprayed millions, nearly 20 million gallons of herbicides across South Vietnam and neighbouring regions, with Agent Orange making up a significant portion of that total. The other consequence was a diminution of precaution. Ecological and humanitarian cautions were recast as subordinate to immediate battlefield utility. Concerns about civilian harm were occasionally registered in the reports and the minutes of staff meetings, and sometimes orders attempted to limit spraying over populated areas or to avoid certain crop types. In practice, the line between denying crops to an enemy and affecting the livelihoods of civilians is not a narrow one. It is a razor placed in a cartographer's hand. Where exactly to draw it is a political choice as much as a technical one, and the choice was made again and again for operational force protection and logistical efficiency. There were alternatives on the table in theory. Engineers could strip vegetation mechanically around bases and roads. The air campaign could be expanded. Pacification programs could attempt to separate people from the insurgency through non-violent means. Each of these alternatives carried costs, political, financial, and human, and none promised the swift, measurable result that a defoliant might deliver on a sortie log. In the calculus of a war judged by tonnage and territory rather than hearts and minds, the chemical looked like a lever. It was cheaper than a prolonged engineering campaign, and less politically fraught than escalating bombing in numbers that would cost more lives and international opprobrium. The irony that a chemical intended to spare human life by making movement safer for troops would produce long-term human consequences was either subordinate to immediate aims, or, in some quarters, not fully acknowledged. What unifies the story of Agent Orange in this phase is the way distinct systems, chemical know-how, industrial capacity, and military doctrine, meshed to create an effect larger than any one of them had predicted. Chemistry provided a means. Industry supplied the scale. Doctrine gave it a name and a purpose. At the seams of these systems were the places where caution should have lived, where a company's laboratory notes might have been read by a procurement officer, where a reactor's operating temperature might have been balked at to demand lower byproducts, where a general might have listened longer to a scientist's warning. Those seams were sutured instead by contracts, by schedules, by the pressing contingency of war. The consequence of those choices was not immediate in every sense. The dioxin carried in the orange-drummed mixture is not loud. It makes no clamour as it settles into soil or into the fat of an animal. It moves slowly. It binds to sediments, to the lipids of fish, to the tissues of birds. It remains in the makeup of a landscape much longer than the moment it is applied. Because the toxicity of TCDD is extraordinary at very low doses, and because it resists breakdown under tropical conditions, the environmental persistence of what was, in a factory, a trace contaminant meant that the industrial decisions of the 1960s were, from the point of view of ecology, acts of deposition that would read like a long, stubborn paragraph in the region's environmental history. This is not a tale of an identifiable villain alone. It is a tale of institutions making choices in concert, laboratories hungry for application, firms that could scale but chose not always to police their margins, and a military that saw in a plant hormone mimic a tactical instrument. It is a tale of a weaponized commercial product, a phrase that ought to cause a small shiver, and of the bureaucratic choices that turned agricultural chemistry into a theatre-wide operation. Behind the crisp language of manuals and memos, there were men and women tightening straps, pilots leaning over maps, engineers listening to pumps, and laboratory technicians reading the slow lines of instruments. In each detail there was a human decision, made under pressures that in the moment seemed decisive and practical. By the time public attention drew lines around Agent Orange and the word dioxin entered the vernacular of a wider world, the mechanics of production and the outlines of doctrine had already written the opening chapters of a catastrophe that would last far beyond the last flight. The chemical lineage, the ready mixture of 2004D and 2045T, had met logistical appetite, and the unwanted byproduct had been allowed, in pockets and quantities, to leave the factory floor and enter landscapes and bodies. What remained, as the history would unfold, was the long task of tracing exposures, passing batch numbers against maps, and asking of a generation whether the ephemeral logic of immediate battlefield advantage had been worth the later facts of persistence and harm. The answer would not be found in a single memo. It would be found in the slow work of epidemiology, and in the courtrooms and fields where memory and evidence gathered like drifting smoke. In January of 1962, when the maps in Washington were still being drawn with polite pencil strokes and this word escalation hung in the air like a weather forecast nobody wanted to read, the United States Air Force began to turn an idea into a routine. Make the jungle stop hiding men. That idea, practiced in laboratories and on test ranges, arrived in Southeast Asia as a program with a smile, a pastoral-sounding name, Operation Ranch Hand, and instruments that had nothing to do with ranches, aircraft, pumps, drums stamped with colour codes, and a chain of command that threaded from the Pentagon, through MACV in Saigon, down to airmen who learned to fly low and to pump orange into the wind. The logic was straightforward to military planners. If cover could be stripped away, ambushes would be rarer, supply routes would be visible, base perimeters would be safer, and, if one believed the arguments presented by strategists in neat memos, the enemy's sources of food could be diminished. The calculus was brutal, efficient, bureaucratic. It sounded, in official language, like a tool, It behaved like a machine. The machine had parts. The most visible part was the Fairchild C123 provider, painted sometimes in dull olive, sometimes in the sudden shine of a tropical sun, sometimes with its belly and chest streaked with the residue of the very chemicals it dispersed. The C-123 was bulky and honest. A workhorse cargo plane adapted for a different purpose. Technicians converted its cargo hold into a chemical cathedral of pumps, filters and tanks, into a dispenser that would turn barrels of herbicide into a curtain of spray that could be laid across a valley, along a road, or around the perimeter of an airstrip. These modified planes received the field designation UC-123. Pilots and crew, often Air Force veterans who had flown cargo and troop missions, learned new routines, how to handle a load of 55-gallon drums of Tulu 4D and Tulu 45T, how to balance weight and wind, how to time a run so the mist would settle through a canopy and not be scattered uselessly into a monsoon squall. The spray apparatus was less glamorous than the aircraft. It was made of tanks, of pumps rated for corrosion because herbicides are not gentle, of booms that extended and released a finely atomized cloud. The drums came ashore from US factories, most famously Dow Chemical and Monsanto among the contractors, shipped to ports in Saigon and then by convoy to storage at major airbases. The drums were labelled with bands of colour. Agent Orange had its orange stripe. There was crude simplicity in that sort of branding. A colour meant to tell logistics crews which cocktail was inside, and those same colours would later become a kind of shorthand for catastrophe. The Army's logistics pipelines ran on manifest sheets and the occasional urgent order from MACV, more herbicide to Pleiku, a refill at Bien Hoa, a swap at Da Nang. Little of this looked like a military campaign in the way bombing did. It looked instead like a supply operation in a far-flung depot, and perhaps that made it easier to bureaucratically sustain. Targets were chosen through a mixture of intelligence streams. There were maps showing known Viet Cong base areas, photographs from reconnaissance flights that made canopies into textures on a page, and requests from ground commanders who wanted the visibility around their outposts improved. In the early years, the priority was perimeter defoliation. Keep the trees back from runway edges, from battalion compounds, from fire bases. By the mid-1960s, the emphasis broadened. Denial operations along infiltration corridors became a strategic obsession. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was less a single road than a braided network of tracks and paths under tree cover, was a particular focus. If the logicians in Saigon could not ever the network by bombing, perhaps they could unmake the jungle itself. Then, in a turn that altered the political and moral calculus, crop destruction was elevated as a formal instrument of war. The argument was clear in military terms. If enemy forces could not feed, they would be less effective. The argument carried weight in duty briefings and in the White House. It made its way into operational orders and into the records of ranch hand sorties. There were tense decision points along the way. The most consequential were not aerial engagements, but memoranda and meetings, discussions inside the Pentagon and the White House about the expansion of the program, debates inside MACV about where limited sorties should be concentrated, and the steady bureaucratic work of authorizations that turned a pilot's run into part of a national strategy. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who in the early 60s oversaw a host of Vietnam policies, and generals such as William Westmoreland, who presided over the larger American commitment, were part of that matrix. Under their watch, the use of herbicides escalated from a niche experimentation into a central operational tool. Rules were written. How close to civilian settlements spraying could occur, what to do when rain or wind threatened unintended drift, how to coordinate with South Vietnamese authorities. Sometimes those rules were followed, sometimes they were not. The tempo of operations became a feature of the campaign. Aerial sorties ran year-round, accelerating in some seasons, slackening in others, but rarely stopping. The strip of sky over much of South Vietnam learned to accommodate consistent low-level flight. Crews would file plans for particular swathes of jungle or rice paddies. The C-123s would take off, our cargo planes transformed into gardeners of a hostile land, and they would fly lines back and forth, sometimes in the stillness of morning, sometimes in the cooler hours of dusk when winds were lighter and the spray would fall truer to its mark. Flights were planned to overlap. Lines were laid down until the canopy looked as if it had been mechanically combed. In a single year, the operation would deliver thousands upon thousands of gallons. Across the decade, it became industrial in scale. Between his 62 and the programme's end in 1971, nearly 20 million gallons of herbicides were released into the Vietnamese landscape, and roughly 11 million gallons of that was the mix that would become infamous under the name Agent Orange, a 50-50 blend of 2004D and 2004-5T. The numbers are blunt instruments. They tell you about quantity, but not about what that quantity carried. The dioxin contaminant, 2003-78-UEDD, that was present in the 2004-5T batches, and that would embed itself in soil and in flesh. Pilots flew low. That was a tactical requirement and a hazard. To get the mist into the canopy and onto the crops required a kind of intimacy with the land. Low altitude, controlled speed, the plane's undercarriage sometimes a few hundred feet from the treetops, a rhythm of approach, release and climb away. The spray widths depended on configuration and chosen altitude. Crews calibrated nozzles and aircraft speed to create the desired swathe. Sometimes the booms would throw a ribbon wide enough to reach the roadside groves and the hedgerows that surrounded villages. Sometimes, in narrower valleys, the spray folded the green inward like a secret being revealed. Weather was always an actor. The monsoon could wash the spray into nothing, or winds could carry it into places nobody had intended. That was part of the reason operations required such tight logistics, forecasts, reconnaissance, and a nervous attention to the maps. The logistics apparatus was elaborate and resilient. Agents were manufactured in US plants, vendor contracts negotiated in suburban offices, and shipments loaded onto freighters bound for Saigon. In theatre, the drums were handled by specialised crews. Bases such as Bien Hoa, outside Saigon, became central nodes in this network. They stored barrels, maintained spray racks, and served as refuelling and maintenance points for the UC-123s. Da Nang and other airfields also played important roles. Ground support teams mixed herbicide loads, checked pumps, repaired nozzles, and kept the aircraft ready. Mechanics who normally changed tyres and replaced spark plugs learned to service pumps and to deal with the corrosive residue that clung to lines. Record keeping, logs of sorties and gallons used, mattered because it was the currency that paid contractors and justified orders up the chain. There were after-action reports that declared successful defoliation in a zone, and there were manifest sheets that counted drums in and out. The whole system was, in cold terms, an ordeal of procurement, transportation, storage, dispensing and reporting that outlasted the novelty of the operation and became standard operating procedure. The contours of those operations etched a geography onto the country. Herbs and sprays did not land everywhere equally. They were poured purposefully. The Mekong Delta, with its patchwork of rice paddies and canals feeding on a rhythm of tides and monsoon rains, was a major locus of crop destruction because it was also a heartland of food supplies. Denying that food to insurgents was a tactical priority. Up above the Central Highlands, Kontum, Pleiku, Dak To and the massive corridors that fed northwards, the forest was dense and the trail ran through it. Those routes saw repeated patterns of defoliation meant to reveal tracks and choke-moving columns. The DMZ in areas near Quang Tri and the Ashao Valley, places that had haunted US commanders for their importance as infiltration or staging areas, received persistent attention. Border provinces such as Tay Ninh, which sat close to Cambodia and to the Iron Triangle near Saigon, were often sprayed to deny cover and to attempt to control cross-border movements. And beyond the borders of South Vietnam, the spray left its mark as well. Portions of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that cut through Laos were subject to herbicidal attention. In some instances, operations crossed into Cambodia. Sometimes these were overt, sometimes they were covert. The maps that emerge from the ranch hand logs and from later inquiries make clear that the chemical rain spilled across political boundaries as easily as it fell from the booms. There were places, of course, that later would be called hotspots, not by planners, but by doctors and ecologists. And those places have simple names because simple names are easier to point at. Bien Hoa and Da Nang, both major air bases, stand among the most persistent. Bien Hoa, in the rich flat country east of Saigon, was both a logistical node and a later symbol of contamination. For drums were stored and mishandled there, and faulty disposal practices left residues in soil and water that persisted beyond the end of the missions. Da Nang, a major hub for all manner of military aviation, likewise carried deposits. The Central Highlands did not have a single name that mattered the way an airbase did. Its contamination was spread across mountains and valleys, in the soils where people planted, and in the river sediments below. The Ho Chi Minh Trail's many corridors, Chepone in Laos, the Mujia Pass, the vast belts of jungle that link north and south, are now often spoken of with a rueful geography, places where paths were revealed, where trees were killed, where the landscape was altered in ways both immediate and lingering. When the spray hit, the effect could be as swift as any machine. Leaves wilted. Within a matter of days, a tree crown could look skeletonized. Green turned to brown and then to a grey that lasted. Crops curled in place and died. Military briefings loved the immediacy. Photographs taken from the air were dramatic in their before and after clarity. An area that had been a dense canopy on Monday could be a skeletal skeleton by Friday. That speed, which pleased commanders, had ecological consequences that the controllers of the program had not always fully accounted for. The tropical environment does not simply rebound. Tropical forests live by a different economy. Nutrient cycling is rapid, and the living canopy is central to maintaining topsoil and to protecting the delicate humus layer that supports growth. Strip away that canopy and the monsoon does what it has always done. It rains. With the green gone, heavy rains hit exposed soils directly. Rainfall that had once been buffered by leaves and branches now gathers force, shears the surface and carries the light topsoil into rivers as brown sediment. Erosion follows. Streams that had been clear become muddied conveyors of earth. Where slopes had been stabilised by root networks, landslides sometimes loosened. The result was a loss of productivity that could not be repaired in a single planting season. Fields that had been prepared for rice or for perennial fruit suddenly became thin and skeletal, and their yields fell. The economic effect was immediate in markets that watched rice bags flow less quickly onto barges, and in villages that found storehouse tables emptying sooner than usual. Habitats frayed. Canopy-dwelling animals lost shelter. Understory species that depended on shade and a moist microclimate saw conditions change in the course of hours and days. Birds that nested in the mid-story found fewer branches to hold onto. Amphibians that needed humidity faced drier leaf litter. Ecologists watching from a distance and sometimes from within the country noted that defoliation did not simply reset a forest to an earlier successional stage. In many areas, the first plants to recolonize were quick-growing grasses and vines that were suited for open, sunlit conditions. Those species could form a choke of herbaceous growth that prevented tree seedlings from establishing, thereby locking the land in a degraded state. That pattern, grass and scrub replacing forest, changed the habitats available to fauna, altered hydrologic flows, and, over time, could change the very face of a watershed. The sociological ripples were immediate as well. Rural livelihoods in South Vietnam were built on a mix of annual crops like rice and on perennial assets like fruit trees and rubber trees. Spray runs often targeted hedgerows and locations just beyond fields, and the collateral damage to orchards and smallholder assets was real. A rubber investment that took years to mature could be damaged in a single session of herbicide application. The loss of such assets forced adjustments in household economies that showed up in market data and in the pleas recorded by local officials. At a larger level, food security was strained in regions where rice paddies had been intentionally sprayed. Markets saw supply shocks some seasons. The South Vietnamese government, which had to balance military imperatives with social stability, recorded complaints. American military reports sometimes noted unexpected civilian effects. Embassy cables occasionally registered diplomatic concern. It was not just the defoliation of trees, it was the defoliation of systems of production, of local economies that were intricately balanced with seasonal cycles. Military and civilian records of the time are blunt in their observations, if not always in their terms of judgment. Ranch hand reports, the logs of the UC-123 sorties, the manifests of herbicide shipped and sprayed, and the aerial photographs taken for after-action assessments together provide a documentary mosaic. They show what the Air Force thought it had achieved: cleared perimeters, opened sight lines, and defoliated corridors used for infiltration. Civilian records, provincial agricultural reports, minutes from local administrative meetings, and local press accounts when they appeared document losses and crop yields, anxieties about land, and the first murmurings of concern about lingering contamination. Scientific reconstructions later would bring these threads together with soil tests and epidemiological studies, but even at the time there were records that noted acute environmental damage, sedimentation in rivers after heavy defoliation, reduced yields in sprayed paddies, visible kills of non-target plants, and, In some localized incidents, fish kills reported by villagers downstream from sprayed areas. Recovery was not a simple matter of time. Tropical ecosystems are resilient in their own ways, but they require certain conditions to regenerate mature forest. Seed sources nearby, undamaged soil, microbial communities, and a succession of different plant species that can take root. Repeated spraying interrupted those conditions. In areas that were repeatedly targeted, in sections of the Central Highlands or along persistent stretches of the trail, the canopy did not simply return to its original composition. Instead, secondary growth often dominated, and the complex architecture of old forest, with its layered canopy and its soil dynamics, took much longer to reappear, if it did at all. The presence of dioxin complicated recovery in another register. The compound binds to organic matter and can persist in soils and sediments for years, sometimes decades, especially in sediments where it is shielded from sunlight and microbial breakdown. That persistence meant that some areas, particularly near storage sites and around spray points, carried a chemical legacy that affected what could be planted safely and how food chains accumulated toxins. There were also legal and administrative echoes. The programme's continuation depended on the same bureaucratic machinery that had sustained it. Orders, manifests, legislative tolerances, and a public mood that tolerated the repurposing of farming chemicals for military ends. Turning away from that machinery required a political shift, one that would not fully arrive until the early 70s, when domestic opposition, a changing strategic environment, and growing scientific concern altered the calculus. The operation wound down in 1971, its planes returned to other bases or were retired, its drums emptied or disposed of, and its logistic footprints left scars in soil and in the memories of logistics men and pilots who had seen their machines applied to living landscapes. Across these years, the image of sprayed land became a part of the archive. Photographs that military officers filed, that journalists later published, that scientists later used as evidence of a changed ecology. They show the immediacy of defoliation and the slower accumulation of consequences. They show places where the green was stripped back and where the earth below responded with its own rhythms of loss, erosion, altered hydrology, changes in species composition. They show the economic adjustments of populations who relied on the land, relocations, shifts in cropping, patterns, and in some places a turn toward marginal employment or migration to towns. The patchwork of sprayed and unsprayed land turned South Vietnam into an uneven palimpsest, a map of effort and consequence. If one listens, as a historian eventually learns to do, to the quiet details locked in those records, patterns emerge that were invisible in the memo that authorized a mission. The planners liked their metrics: acres defoliated, sorties flown, gallons used. The soil and the people kept a different kind of score. The length of time a valley took to green again, the yield of a rice harvest 2 seasons after a spray, the accumulation of sediment in a riverbed. Those measures are less tidy, less amenable to concise reporting, and therefore they sat for a while in the margins, but they were real and they were immediate. In the end, the story of ranch hands' operations is as much about logistics and mechanical rhythm as it is about strategy. It is about how a set of airplanes and pumps, backed by contracts and authorized by decrees, came to alter landscapes in precise, repeated manners. It is about how spray booms and their crews, guided by maps from commanders in Saigon and by the textbooks of the Pentagon, learned to choreograph a pattern of release that would be felt in soil chemistry and in downstream markets. It is about how decisions, to focus on corridors, to include crop destruction as policy, to continue the program through the late 1960s, were the product of institutions, not just individuals. It is finally about how those institutions measured success and how different kinds of evidence, aerial photographs, procurement manifests, agricultural reports, later became data for an assessment that would take decades to complete. The geography of that spray is a kind of telling map. Patterned concentrations appear where the trail pushed goods southward and where bases clustered in the lowlands and along the coast. The Mekong Delta's patchwork of rice and canals, a place of abundance, became a principal area for crop denial. The Central Highlands, with its corridors and feeder roads, was where leaf cover mattered most to concealment and thus where defoliation was intense. The border provinces, the DMZ belt and the river corridors leading to Saigon received persistent attention because they mattered militarily. Those patterns meant that the chemical fall was not a random rain, but a directed instrument of war. aimed at strategic features of a landscape and at the people who lived in their shadows. And when the mist fell, it did not distinguish neatly between what the planners called valid military targets and what civilians called home. It fell across hedgerows and around groves. It crept into watersheds and folded into the organic fabric of the land. In the months and years that followed the flights, the immediate spectacle of brown crowns and stripped branches gave way to slower processes, soil slipping away, new growth that was not the old, fruit trees that took longer to reach bearing age or never reached it at all. Markets adapted. People adapt. But adaptation is not regeneration. It is a reassembly of lives, sometimes around smaller means of subsistence, sometimes by migration. These were consequences that appear in provincial records as declines in output, in anecdotal reports of increased hardship, and in international studies that would later catalogue environmental change. The military's own notes, meanwhile, rarely framed their victories in terms of ecological cost. A successful defoliation read as a tactical advantage in a report, and that advantage was real enough for the commander constructing a perimeter or a supply run. But maps annotated with success do not record the cost of soil worn thin, of rain-borne sediments smothering fish-spawning grounds, or of pasture that would become for years less productive. Nor do operation logs measure the chemical persistence of dioxin that adheres to organic matter and can slacken the promise of a field for seasons yet to come. So the story of these years is double. It is an account of how a bureaucratic industrial system turned herbicide into ordnance, with pilots and pumps and manifests and mountains of drums, and it is an account of what that ordnance did to land and livelihoods in the immediate sense, a rapid defoliation that sent erosion running and markets buckling and habitats fraying, and in the longer sense leaving soils and sediments with a bracelet of contamination that would bind human and ecological futures together in ways unanticipated by the men who first made the plans. The planes flew, the orange-striped drums emptied, the land wrote back slowly with leaf and river and harvest, and the record of that reply can be read in the slow change of a landscape that remembers. The first thing to understand is that the human consequences of Agent Orange did not arrive all at once like a single thunderclap. They came in layers, some immediate and unmistakable, others slow as sediment, settled and then resurfacing long after the pilots packed their spray cans away and the war left Vietnam. To walk the edges of the era, the flight strips and bare earth around Bien Hoa and Da Nang, the central highland valleys where the Montagnard people tended their gardens, the rice paddies of Phuc Tuy that lay in the path of repeated runs, is to recognise how the same chemical that stripped leaves also entered bodies, sometimes at once, sometimes as a whisper that became a chronic voice. The acute injuries were often the easiest to see. The ranch hand crews and herbicide handlers who had direct heavy contact reported skin eruptions and ire and mucous membrane irritation. Soldiers who rode in the spray or walked through freshly defoliated areas told of a smell, a sharpness on the skin that would not wash away with soap. Chloracne, that grotesque acne-like affliction, named for the chlorinated compounds that cause it, was the signature. When chloracne came, it was not poetic, it was chemical, and it left behind not only lesions but a dangerous clarity. Here was a direct bodily response to an external agent, visible, diagnosable, hard to translate into politics. From that visible beginning, the illness spectrum widened. Among the veterans, the most scrutinised cohorts were the men of Operation Ranch Hand, the Air Force crews who flew the Fairchild C-123 providers, sprayed thousands of missions between 62 and 71, loaded drums of defoliant at fields that sometimes smelled faintly of solvent and hot metal, whose blood and fat were sampled, compared, and followed over decades in what became the Air Force Health Study. That study, initiated in the late 70s and continuing through the 90s and beyond, gave a model for measuring exposure by testing serum TCDD levels and then following morbidity and mortality. It was not perfect. No long-term study of war and chemical exposure could be. But it gave shape to an otherwise amorphous fear. Ranch hand participants had higher average serum dioxin than comparison groups. They had in some analyses higher rates of some cancers and metabolic disorders. They showed the feared signature diseases, soft tissue sarcomas in some, lymphomas in others, perturbations of glucose metabolism leading in some to a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. Vietnamese civilians told a parallel broader story. The government in Hanoi, especially from the 1990s onward, as the damaged communities organised and counts were compiled, estimated somewhere on the order of 3 million people affected and more than 100,000 children with congenital anomalies ostensibly linked to herbicides and dioxin contamination. Local clinics in provinces such as Quang Tri and Thua Tien Hui documented clusters of birth defects, developmental delay and reproductive problems. In the Central Highlands, Kon Tum, Gia Lai, Pleiku, indigenous Montagnard communities who lived close to whole forests and who traditionally hunted, gathered and ate local wildlife and fish were exposed through all of those routes. An animal killed near a sprayed stream, a pig rooting through contaminated soil, a fish pulled from a silted canal. These were vectors, small and intimate, by which a wartime tactic became a peacetime burden. Patterns emerged that epidemiology would later try to pass. Acute dermatologic and mucous membrane effects that could be tied to heavy proximal exposure. Chronic diseases such as certain hematologic malignancies and soft tissue sarcomas that showed up decades later. Neurological complaints, tremors, headaches, cognitive complaints that clustered in veterans and civilians alike, sometimes in ways that suggested a toxicant but rarely in patterns that allowed neat cause and effect statements at the level courts or legislatures require. Reproductive harm was especially haunting because it suggested a link between one generation's exposure and the next fate. Families in provinces with heavy spraying reported higher rates of miscarriages, stillbirths, low birth weight, and congenital abnormalities like neural tube defects and cleft palates. Measurements taken later from hotspots near air bases, Bien Hoa, where stockpiles of Agent Orange had been stored, and where soils remained contaminated, and Da Nang, where burn pits and spills left lasting pockets of dioxin in sediments, confirmed that local food items carried elevated dioxin residues. Adipose tissue samples from residents sometimes showed levels above what one would expect in unexposed populations. But here the story becomes methodical and slow as rock turning to soil, because attribution is difficult and latency is patient. Chronic diseases, like many cancers and neurological disorders, do not arrive with a ticket that says Agent Orange. They happen in bodies, in places, in contexts shot through with other risks. Poverty, malnutrition, infections, other occupational or agricultural exposures, and in veterans the rigours of combat itself. The defenders of causality frequently looked for fingerprints, dose responses in cohort studies, repeatable patterns across populations, and where those fingerprints were clear, recognition followed. Chlorachin, soft tissue sarcoma, certain lymphomas. Where patterns were subtler, where confounders and small numbers clouded a signal, debates hardened. Veterans in Allied contingents experienced their own versions of the same spectrum. Australia, which deployed several battalions between 1962 and 1972, assembled its own evidence and advocacy movements. South Korea, which sent some 300,000 troops during the conflict, later faced disputes about recognition and assistance for its veterans. In every country, once the chemicals were introduced into human networks of food, family and community, the pathways multiplied. Children whose fathers had served in Vietnam sought answers for birth defects. Wives who had lived in military housing near storage facilities or burned wastes claimed increased miscarriages. Ethnic minorities whose subsistence patterns involved wild game and freshwater fish found contaminants where market economies assumed they would not be. There were also the immediate occupational incidents: mishandled drums, accidental contacts, exposure of handlers during mixing and distribution in the United States, and on the docks of Saigon and Cam Ranh Bay. Manufacturing workers in plants that produced 2004 5-WT and its precursor occasionally developed chlorachin and other symptoms. Community exposures in places like Nitro, West Virginia, and in Seveso, Italy, latter an industrial accident in 1976 that released a dioxin cloud among the civilian population, provided grim non-military confirmation that the compound at the centre of Agent Orange was dangerous to people, not just plants. The US also had its own domestic stories. Times Beach, Missouri, where waste oil contaminated with dioxin was sprayed on roads in the 1970s, leading to a mass cleanup and evacuation in the early 1980s. Those incidents became part of the public's visceral understanding of dioxin risk, even as the science of chronic, low-level exposure remained contested. Scientific language acquired itself a funeral pallor as more evidence accumulated. Bioaccumulation, persistence, latency, each a cold, technical word for human lives. The people who carried the long-term burden did not always fit cleanly into the cohorts scientists could easily measure. Some exposures were transient and intense, a pilot whose flight suit was soaked with herbicide, a loader who fell into a drum, and these episodes left behind high body burdens and clearer links to disease, while many more exposures were low-dose but chronic, mediated through a diet of contaminated fish and fat. That multiplicity of pathways made it difficult to draw a single map linking rain to ruin, but it did not diminish the reality that for many places the chemical cloud had established new ecological steady states. Soils and sediments that acted as slow-release reservoirs of dioxin, food webs that concentrated it, bodies that stored it, like time capsules. Those time capsules, human adipose tissue, breast milk samples, animal fats, told scientists some things that geography alone could not. In the late 1970s and into the 1980s, it became technologically feasible to measure dioxin congeners by gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, to compute toxic equivalents and to compare them across populations. Shots of blood and biopsies revealed that certain populations carried levels that were not only elevated but biologically significant. For ranch hand veterans, for instance, serum TCDD levels were demonstrably higher than those of comparison veterans at baseline. They declined over subsequent decades as the compounds slowly left the body, but the decline was measured in years, not months. In civilians from hotspot areas in Vietnam and in nearby food organisms, fish, eggs, pig fat, TEQ measurements showed how an environmental contaminant could leap into a living economy and hang there. The human cost was therefore not a single disease, but a constellation of risks, some acute and some chronic, some epidemiologically stubborn and some legally persuasive. Some families received compensation or recognition, many did not. Governments and companies argued, scientists argued, and those who were sick oscillated between the quiet, pragmatic paperwork of claims and the noisier politics of protest. The rain that had been ordered from the air had washed itself into bodies. If the human story demands attention, the chemical story explains why the human story did not stop. At the heart of Agent Orange's longevity was a molecule with a small name and a long shadow. 2003-7-8 tetrachlorodibenzo-P dioxin, usually abbreviated as TCDD, the unintended byproduct that hitchhiked on the industrial production of 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, one half of the Agent Orange mixture. TCDD is not the herbicide, it is the impurity that made the herbicide notorious. In each of the manufacturer's plants, under certain conditions of temperature and reaction chemistry, the process of creating 2,4,5-T yielded this dioxin, and the more poorly controlled the process, the greater the yield. Once present, TCDD behaved with a stubbornness that chemists and physicians came to speak of with a mix of academic caution and practical dread. At a molecular scale, the dioxin is flat, planar, halogenated and uncompromisingly lipophilic, fat-loving. That simple affinity explains half of the problem. TCDD does not readily dissolve into river water and wash away. It prefers the fat in an insect's body, an intestine's lining, a fish's liver, human adipose tissue. Measured in toxic equivalents, TCDD is the yardstick against which other related compounds are judged. The International Agency for Research on Cancer inspected the evidence, and in 1997 placed TCDD in Group 1, carcinogenic to humans. That was a formal recognition of a danger that many industrial and military actors had been reluctant to acknowledge. The second characteristic is persistence. In laboratory conditions, the molecule may slowly degrade under ultraviolet light and microbial action, but in the real world of silted riverbeds, anaerobic sediments and clinging organic matter, the half-life of a dioxin molecule can be measured in decades, sometimes in generations. In human beings, biological half-life studies have estimated years for elimination. A person with a high TCDD serum concentration in 75 could still carry significant residues a decade or more later. In the tropical soils of Vietnam, where intense sun and rice field hydrology complicate microbial dynamics, pockets of contaminated sediment around air bases became the modern equivalent of archaeological burial grounds, layers of contaminated muck from which food and water could extract the toxin. When a chemical likes fat, it biomagnifies. Plankton collects trace contamination, small fish eat plankton and grow slightly more contaminated. Larger fish eat those fish and concentrate the compound further. A catfish 2 meters long may carry a TQ many times that of the water it swims in. Humans who eat those fish, particularly communities dependent on riverine and lagoon fisheries, thereby ingest a concentrated dose. Pigs that root in contaminated soil or cattle that graze on cut straw pick up residues and deposit them in lard. The popular Vietnamese diet in many rural areas, which includes substantial amounts of fish and animal fats, thus became an unwitting exposure pathway. The chemical did not travel only in the air. It travelled in food, in milk, in the intimate economies of feeding and cooking that define everyday life. At a physiological level, the most important story is the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, the AHR. TCDD binds to AHR and turns it into a transcriptional puppet, dragging it into the nucleus and altering patterns of gene expression in cells. The result is pleiotropic, a fancy way of saying that the cascade of effects is varied and complex. In fetuses and developing organisms, where timing of gene expression matters for limb formation, neural tube closure and organogenesis, such misexpression can have especially devastating consequences. In adult tissues, perturbation of the same pathways can alter cell proliferation and immune function, which is partly why animal models show where TCDD exposure can act as a carcinogen and an immunotoxin. These are molecular stories, but they are implicated in the human complaints: immune dysfunctions, susceptibility to infections, alterations in metabolic control, and increases in specific cancers. One of the most insidious consequences of TCDD's chemistry is that it turned a tactical, episodic military action into an ecological and public health axis. A single season of spraying could leave enough contaminant in a valley or riverbank that local food webs and local people remained exposed for generations. That is how episodic violence embedded itself in the slow rhythms of bodies. The persistence meant that even as spraying stopped, the public health problem did not. It became instead an infrastructure issue. How to find, quantify and remove contaminated soils, how to change diets to avoid biomagnified fish, how to educate and compensate communities and to treat affected individuals when the exposure was invisible and the pathway long. Science tried to catch up. Toxicologists ran the animal models. Epidemiologists assembled cohorts and compared disease rates. Clinicians catalogued syndromes. The international literature on dioxin broadened after the Seveso accident in 1976 and the Yusha Yusheng incidents in Japan and Taiwan, mass poisonings from contaminated rice oil in 1968 and 1979, which offered human clinical confirmation that chlorinated aromatic compounds could cause severe systemic illness, congenital anomalies and developmental delays. Together, these episodes began to form a web of evidence. Industrial accidents and farm-scale poisonings, military herbicide programs and community contamination all suggested that TCDD and related compounds could, under the right circumstances, be devastating. Yet the path from scientific suspicion to consensus and policy was neither straight nor fast. The story of Agent Orange is as much a story about knowledge contested as it is about molecular fate. Decades of science saw military reports, corporate-funded studies, independent epidemiology, litigated consensus, and institutional reviews that each pulled the narrative in different directions. Early military and contractor investigations insisted on limited human risk, arguing, sometimes with selective data, that the herbicides were not chemical warfare and posed negligible long-term threats to humans. Chemical corporations defended their products in court and in industry journals, pointing to gaps in causal chains. Veterans and civilian activists accused them of suppression and delay. The tension between technical caution and moral urgency created an often ugly chorus. In the United States, the litigation of the 1980s crystallized the contest. In 1994, a class action suit against the chemical manufacturers, Dow, Monsanto, Diamond Shamrock and others, resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement for US veterans and dependents but carried no admission of liability. The settlement provided money, but not resolution. For Vietnamese plaintiffs, who later tried to sue in US courts, legal avenues were closed by doctrines of foreign relations and political question, effectively leaving their claims to diplomacy and to the less certain courts of international public opinion. In the policy arena, the Agent Orange Act of 1991 represented an institutional acknowledgement that the scientific evidence needed a structured independent review. The Act instructed the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to ask the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine to review the health literature and determine whether specific diseases were associated with exposure. The resulting IOM reports, periodic, rigorous, conservative, tried to classify evidence using categories such as sufficient evidence, limited suggestive, inadequate insufficient, and limited suggestive evidence of no association. Those categories mattered because they guided both compensation and research priorities. Methodologically, the field was a minefield. Exposure assessment was notoriously difficult. For many epidemiologists, the simplest approach on classifying anyone who served in Vietnam as exposed was blunt but pragmatic. More refined approaches used military records, unit locations, flight logs, and there's work of David Stellman and colleagues in the early 2000s, which mapped spraying with a granularity previously unavailable, or biochemical measures such as serum TCDD levels and adipose tissue assays. Each method had trade-offs. Self-report invited recall bias. Proximity measures brought ecological fallacies. Biomarkers were expensive and often unavailable for large cohorts, especially among Vietnamese civilians. Confounders multiplied the difficulty. Smoking, hepatitis infections, malnutrition, other occupational exposures, stress and differential access to medical care could all produce disease patterns that might mimic or mask dioxin effects. Latency complicated the picture. Some cancers appear decades after exposure, by which time populations shift, records get lost, and diagnostic criteria change. Selection bias worked both ways. People who believed they were harmed were more likely to enroll in studies or seek diagnosis, potentially inflating associations. Meanwhile, the healthy soldier effect, a phenomenon by which military populations have lower overall mortality than the general population because of pre-enlistment screening, can obscure increases in specific diseases. Small sample sizes and rare outcomes like certain sarcomas made statistical power another frequent problem. Political interference was not merely theoretical. Secrecy surrounding spray records and manufacturer documents, corporate funding of research, and governmental reluctance to accept broad liability all shaped which studies were conducted, which were funded, and how findings were interpreted. Veterans groups, environmental NGOs and Vietnamese associations accused agencies of stonewalling. Agencies responded that science must be cautious. The tension is almost comical if one thinks of science as a calm, dispassionate arbiter. Evidence did not float in a vacuum but in a current of budgets, legal risk, public fear, and the politics of reparations. The Institute of Medicine's conservative classification scheme designed to prevent overreach had the unintended effect of delaying recognition for many sufferers. The bar for sufficient evidence is high when lives and livelihoods are on the line. Over time, evidence accreted. Independent mapping of spray records allowed better exposure classification for Vietnamese populations. Serum measurements clarified exposure gradients among veterans and civilians. Animal studies demonstrated plausible mechanisms of carcinogenesis and developmental toxicity through AHR signaling and epigenetic change. In the laboratory, multi-generational studies showed reproductive and developmental impacts that lent plausibility to human reports of transgenerational harm. Epidemiology grew more sophisticated, using nested case control designs and adjusting for a range of confounders. Meta-analyses pulled together disparate studies to seek patterns in the noise. Yet scientific debate continues. Newer studies probe epigenetic mechanisms and attempt to untangle the contributions of dioxin from other wartime exposures, and they do so within a landscape reshaped by the remediation efforts and international diplomacy. The United States, Vietnam, and international donors have engaged in remediation projects at Bien Hoa, Da Nang, and other hotspots, removing contaminated soils and treating sediments, which is both remediation and an admission that the molecule had been left behind by the war. The settlements, the cleanups, the IOM reports, and the lawsuits are all chapters in an ongoing attempt to convert molecular knowledge into policy and recompense. The human cost, therefore, is folded into a longer history of chemistry, logistics, and politics. The rain that fell from the plains did what rain usually does. It changed landscapes and lives. But because that rain carried a molecule that preferred fat to water, that bound to soil and seeped into food chains, that spoke to a cell's nuclear machinery and altered it, the consequences could echo. Science has been slow but persistent in chasing those echoes, and the law even slower. In the interim, families and communities have had to live with the ambiguity, with the knowledge that some risks are recognised some are suspected, and some will remain in the murky intersection between human tragedy and the limits of proof. The quiet truth is this: the chemical rain did not keep killing because it had malice. It kept appearing in new guises because chemistry and ecology allowed it to. The political and scientific questions surrounding Agent Orange are, in the end, attempts to reckon with that mechanistic fact and to decide how, collectively, to respond when a small molecule has lived longer in the world than the decisions that produced it. The first legal ripples came not as thunderclaps, but as patient grinding tides, each lawsuit a pebble thrown into a sea that refused to stay calm. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, United States veterans, their lawyers, and a handful of determined organizations began stitching together a case that would, in time, demand that corporations and courts face the consequences of a spray program that had been planned in offices and executed from the sky. The lawsuits were complicated by the plain fact that Agent Orange had been supplied to the military, part of the chemical industrial choreography of war, and that chemical firms had made enormous profits selling defoliants whose fingerprints could now be traced, however faintly, to illness and death. Plaintiffs named manufacturers such as Monsanto and Dow Chemical alongside several smaller firms, and they did so in the language of product liability, negligence, and sometimes conspiracy. The allegation was simple and awful. These companies made substances contaminated with TCD, a dioxin, and those substances had been used in Vietnam, and as a direct result people had suffered in body and life. Courtrooms, judges and lawyers are not scenes that lend themselves to theatrical flourish, and historians prefer that. Legal strategy came down to numbers and precedent, to gathering medical records and internal company memos, to the slow, patient alchemy of turning memory into admissible evidence. The plaintiff's bar marshalled veterans who could testify to the sight of orange barrels, to the smell of defoliant on the tarmac, and to their own diagnoses. They combed archives for procurement documents showing specifications and delivery of 245T and 24D. The defense, by contrast, could point to orders from the Pentagon, to operational claims about military necessity, and to the scientific uncertainties of the moment. Science, in those rooms, became a kind of proxy war. Epidemiologists and toxicologists became witnesses. Peer-reviewed papers were paraded like trophies. The meaning of causation was argued until it frayed at the edges. The political air, of course, was charged. The Reagan administration's posture in the 80s was not one of apology. The United States government asserted varying degrees of distance from corporate liability, while simultaneously resisting broader admissions of responsibility. The Department of Defense had long claimed that the use of herbicides in Vietnam was a necessary military tactic meant to deny cover to enemy forces. That claim, easily summarized, had an enormous legal effect. It complicated direct suits against the government and invited plaintiffs to press instead against the firms that had made the chemicals. The manufacturers, wary of the precedent a trial might set, preferred settlement to the unpredictable theatre of jury verdicts. Settlement allowed them to avoid formal admissions of liability and to limit exposure. In 1984, those converging pressures produced a settlement that resonates in legal history as much for what it promised as for what it withheld. A grouping of chemical manufacturers agreed to pay $180 million into a fund to be distributed to US veterans and their families. It was, by any reasonable measure, a lot of money. It was also a political solution. Companies did not confess wrongdoing, the money was not, in legal terms, an admission of causation, and the fund carried with it the strictures of class action cleanup, eligibility criteria, proof thresholds, and a bureaucracy apt to frustrate those who needed relief most. Some veterans accepted the settlement as a practical route to care. Others felt betrayed, as if money could not and should not be the only currency for culpability. Parallel to these corporate settlements, the legislative branch and the administrative machinery of government had to grapple with a problem that would not remain confined to the courthouse: the living veterans and their illnesses. The government's institutional response developed in fits. In 1991, Congress enacted the Agent Orange Act, a compact between law and science that shifted the burden of proof in important ways. The Act required that the Secretary of Veterans Affairs consult evaluations conducted by the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine, to determine which diseases could be presumed to be associated with herbicide exposure. It was not a blanket admission of guilt. It was a procedural mechanism to grant benefits where science indicated an association. This was, in effect, the state saying, "We will not try every individual claim as if it were a one-off miracle of coincidence. We will make presumptions where the scientific community deems them warranted." That act seeded a slow expansion of benefits. Over the ensuing decades, the VA established presumptions for various cancers and conditions. Some, like chloroquine, had been recognized early as clearly linked to dioxin exposure. Others were added later as the scientific consensus hardened: non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, certain soft tissue sarcomas, and later conditions such as type 2 diabetes and other chronic diseases. The listings grew, often following the cautious, incremental reports of the National Academy, and each new addition was the product of political bargaining as much as of epidemiology. For families living with loss and long-term disability, the compensation mechanisms mattered because they could mean access to medical care, to monthly payments, to an official acknowledgement, even if partial, that exposure had been consequential. But here is where the story grows particularly bitter. The legal remedies available to Vietnamese citizens were and remained so constrained as to be nearly illusory. Plaintiffs in Vietnam, people who had watched their crops brown and their neighbours sicken, tried to use foreign courts to access justice. Many pursued claims in US courts. Their arguments often echoed those of American veterans: negligence, failure to warn, design defects. But courts in the United States proved inhospitable, for reasons both jurisprudential and political. Judges cited lack of jurisdiction, the difficulty of adjudicating foreign harms, obstacles like the political question doctrine, and the sovereign shield protecting wartime acts. The claims of Vietnamese plaintiffs confronted not only legal doctrine, but the practical barrier of time. Memories blurred, records vanished, witnesses died. Foreign courts, which might perhaps have been more sympathetic, posed their own procedural and evidentiary barricades. The result was a form of denial that operated through procedure rather than through a straightforward verdict. Dismissal in this case functioned as erasure. The settlement in 1984 and the subsequent American policy choices birthed a steady, noisy debate. Was money an adequate substitute for responsibility? Did the settlement and the US focus on veterans' benefits tacitly absolve the United States from broader reparations? Chemical companies maintained their denials of wrongdoing while funding the settlement, and the US government, wary of opening a floodgate of claims, preferred bilateral development assistance to transnational litigation. It is worth noting the political cost-benefit calculations. Trial could have exposed internal corporate communications and procurement practices. Settlement did not. The strategy of containment, legal and diplomatic, proved effective. It restrained the legal system's appetite for expansive remedies, redirected energy into administrative channels, and left much of the moral accounting to public argument, to NGOs, and to history. And there, in the margins of courts and ministries, a different kind of power began to grow. The quiet, relentless authority of grassroots mobilization and international advocacy. What the courts did not decide, people insisted upon in village squares and veterans' halls, in lecture theatres and on the steps of embassies. In the United States, former servicemen formed organizations. Ranch hand veterans, who had been the Air Force crews involved in the spraying program, banded together to tell stories. The Vietnam Veterans of America, formed in the late 1970s, lent institutional weight to claims for healthcare and recognition. These American veterans, once politically marginalized, became a kind of moral vanguard for wider attention, their testimonies difficult to ignore precisely because they limned the interior life of the military operation. Their existence complicated the picture the Pentagon had painted. They carried uniforms and scars and the authority of presence. Across the Pacific, Vietnamese civic groups and associations crystallized around the figure of the child with birth defects, around the elder with cancer, around the farmer with barren soil. The Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange Dioxin, often called VAVA, became a central voice within Vietnam, arguing for recognition, for rehabilitation and for remediation. Their work was not only domestic, they became interlocutors with foreign NGOs, with international media, and with sympathetic researchers. Families of victims camped in front of embassies, wrote letters, organised photo exhibits, and told their stories to filmmakers and journalists who came with cameras and pens. Images of children with deformed limbs and of fields where nothing grew were difficult to forget. Transnational advocacy networks knit together these disparate efforts. A film shown in a European festival would find a way back to a village in the Mekong Delta. A report by an American NGO would be translated and displayed in Hanoi. NGOs such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, alongside a constellation of smaller advocacy groups, conducted empirical investigations, publicised findings, and pressured governments to act. The power of narrative, of eyewitness testimony, of video, of photojournalism was enormous. When a surgeon's hands are shown performing reconstructive procedures, when a field researcher speaks of soil samples in laboratories, public opinion shifts. Governments notice. Documentary filmmakers became historians in motion, turning archival footage, government memos and family testimonies into moving mosaics that bent the arc of public sympathy. Journalists too played their part. Work that began in local papers sometimes landed in national outlets, and the moral geography of Agent Orange began to change in readers' minds worldwide. It was no longer only an American veteran's tale. The visual rhetorics, the orange triangle of rusted barrels, the imprint of spray patterns in rice paddies, the infants with congenital anomalies, travelled easily in the image economies of television and print. Media campaigns were often strategic, crafted to put pressure on corporations and governments. NGOs took advantage of the rising information infrastructure of the late 20th and early 21st centuries to using international conferences and United Nations foray to amplify claims. The result was a mounting legitimacy for the demands of victims and an increasing unwillingness on the part of some donors and governments to remain aloof. Fundraising and humanitarian aid followed the media attention, but not in neat proportion to need. International donors provided money for clinics, for prosthetics, for research. Universities made partnerships with Vietnamese medical centres to study dioxin and its effects. In some instances, the exchange was generous. Laboratories shared protocols, researchers trained technicians, and epidemiological frameworks were developed collaboratively. In other cases, the aid felt like a bandage on a structural wound. Clinics without sufficient staff or supplies, research projects that stalled for want of sustained funding. Still, the involvement of international actors meant that the problem could no longer be contained within national discourses. It became a transnational issue that in turn influenced policy. The transition from advocacy to technical remediation was predictably arduous. Recognition that dioxin and related compounds had not only long half-lives, but also the propensity to bind to organic matter in soils reframed the problem as a long-term environmental one, requiring engineering, money, and political will. Dioxin is not a thing you can simply mop up. It clings to sediments, to fatty tissue in the food chain, to the very matrix of the places where it landed. Remediation strategy therefore had to grapple with an ecological truth, the contaminant's tenacity. The tools available sat along a spectrum of invasion and conservatism, from the brute force removal of contaminated earth to gentler ideas that relied on biological processes. The most straightforward approach, and perhaps most intuitively satisfying, is excavation followed by thermal treatment or high-temperature incineration. You dig out the soil that contains the highest concentrations of dioxin, and you subject it to heat sufficient to break the molecule apart. This method is effective in destroying dioxin. It is also costly, requiring transportation, specialised incinerators or enclosed thermal desorption units, and careful handling to avoid secondary contamination. Transportation logistics are themselves fraught. Moving thousands of cubic metres of contaminated earth across national roads and into treatment facilities requires permits, security and public consultation, not to mention the fiscal wherewithal to pay. But where political will exists and money is available, thermal destruction is a literal way of making the contaminant disappear. Containment and capping present another, less invasive approach. In places where excavation would be too disruptive or too expensive, engineers have used impermeable caps, slurry walls and controlled landfills to isolate contaminated sediments. These methods can stabilise a site and prevent immediate exposure, especially where human contact or food chain pathways are limited. The drawback is that they do not remove the hazard, they only manage it. Capping requires long-term maintenance and surveillance. The cap is only as good as the institutions that promise to watch over it for decades. In regions where governance is resource-constrained, that promise is fragile. Thermal desorption has become a popular compromise in many contexts. Soil is heated to temperatures that volatilize dioxin, capturing the off-gases into treatment system. It is less extreme than full incineration, enormously technical but somewhat more portable, and has been used in several high-profile hotspots. The method's success depends on precise control of temperatures and containment of emissions, and it raises its own questions about cost and the disposal of treated residues. Vitrification, turning soil into glass-like inert material by intense heat, offers another high-end solution, but its expense places it out of reach for many remediation budgets. Biological methods, phytoremediation and other bioremediation approaches, have been hailed in some quarters as the kinder, gentler future. Phytoremediation uses plants that either accumulate or transform contaminants. Certain species, for instance, can take up organic pollutants into their tissues or stimulate microbial communities in the rhizosphere that degrade certain compounds. The idea is appealing. Leave nature to heal itself. The reality is less romantic. Dioxin's chemical structure renders it highly resistant to biodegradation. Plants can sequester but not reliably destroy it. Phytoremediation is therefore slow and, for hotspots with high concentrations, likely insufficient as a standalone technology. It can, however, be part of a mixed-mode strategy, reducing exposure pathways where removal would be prohibitively expensive. Case studies reveal how technical the choice is as much political as scientific. At Da Nang Airport, for instance, a site long identified by Vietnamese authorities as heavily contaminated, the decision to pursue excavation and treatment reflected both scientific assessment and diplomatic negotiation. The Vietnamese government sought assistance, and the United States eventually provided expertise, monitoring and funding to support an excavation-based project. When international partners collaborate, they bring not only technology but also standards, protocols for sampling, for risk assessment, for consultation with communities. Those standards are crucial. They determine what counts as success. A site may be clean by one metric and still dangerous by another. The selection of endpoints, how low the dioxin concentration must fall, is therefore a normative as well as technical decision. Bien Hoa, near Ho Chi Minh City, stands as another critical site in these debates. It was one of the largest of the former US air bases and one of the most stubborn contamination challenges. The soil there exhibited hotspots of very high dioxin concentrations. Engineers and policymakers debated whether to excavate deeply to dredge sediments from ponds, or to use containment strategies at multiple locations. The logistical challenge was enormous. The sheer volume of contaminated material, the need to protect workers, and the social dimension of working near populated areas. Community engagement became central. Residents wanted to know what the plans meant for their land, for their livelihoods, and for their children. Remediation efforts thus required not only heavy machinery and laboratories, but also translators, public meetings, and long-term commitments to monitoring. Cost inevitably curbed aspiration. Remediation at the necessary technical level is expensive. International donors could underwrite pilot programs, but a national-scale cleanup of low-level, widespread contamination would require funding beyond the capacities of most partner agencies. The result is triage. Prioritize the worst hotspots, secure water supplies, and reduce acute exposure pathways. But the land itself sometimes remained contaminated enough to limit agricultural use, thereby bringing consequences for food security and economic life. For many villagers, the trade-off was between immediate economic necessity and a long-term reduction in risk. No policy could resolve that tension without resources and transformative commitments. Monitoring and measurement presented another, less visible challenge. Dioxin analytic chemistry is specialized. Laboratories require high-resolution gas chromatography mass spectrometry, HRGC, HRMS, trained personnel and strict quality control. Sampling protocols must avoid cross-contamination and follow chain-of-custody rules. For decades, the scarcity of capable labs in Vietnam meant that samples were sometimes sent abroad for confirmation, which raised questions about sovereignty and timeliness. Building local capacity became an explicit part of remediation projects, training technicians, equipping labs, and harmonizing methods with international standards. This was not merely a technical investment, it was a political one, an implicit recognition that Vietnam needed scientific independence to verify claims about contamination and to insist on remediation that met its own standards. Political will, finally, is the hinge upon which much pivoted. Where governments, national and provincial, saw remediation as a priority, funds flowed, projects moved forward, and communities felt heard. Where political attention lagged, so too did action. That calculus of will was shaped by international relations. The normalization of US-Vietnam relations in the 90s opened doors for cooperative environmental projects, and as economic ties deepened in the early 21st century, cooperation on dioxin slowly became part of the bilateral menu. But political will was not only about diplomatic convenience, it was also about popular pressure. Vietnamese civil society, veterans groups and international NGOs kept the issue alive. American veterans organisations kept pressure on their government, and in many donor countries public campaigns raised consciousness and funds. There were 2 legal and symbolic victories that mattered even if they fell short of broad reparations. Court settlements and legislative presumptions acknowledged, in pragmatic terms, that exposure had been consequential. International funding for remediation, even if partial, validated the victims' claims in a way that mere rhetoric could not. Documentaries, photos and human testimony ensured that the memory of the rain, of the orange barrels and of the affected bodies did not fade. These were slow victories, incremental and sometimes unsatisfying, but they were victories nonetheless. And so the story winds onward. Litigation produced money, but not a sweeping confession. Policy created presumptions and benefits, but did not erase the global inequities of responsibility. Grassroots movements forced recognition and opened space for technical remediation, but could not always command the resources necessary for comprehensive cleanup. The interplay of courts, NGOs, scientists, diplomats and communities shaped a response that was as much about language, how we describe causation, how we certify exposure, as about tractors and thermal units. It required, in short, the work of law, the patience of science, and the stubbornness of ordinary people who would not let their losses be forgotten. In the quiet hours of the night, when the larger public moves on to the next headline, and the orange stains of history fade in newspaper archives, those who keep vigil remain. Veterans meet in halls lit by low bulbs to compare aches and prescriptions. Mothers in Vietnam tend the wounds of their children and the scorched soil, and local associations gather records and ration out solidarity. In laboratory hoods, technicians calibrate instruments to tease apart the tiniest fragments of dioxin molecules. At excavation sites, heavy lift cranes move earth that once sheltered aircraft and now harbours a toxic past. And above all, the work of remediation, technical, legal, moral, continues in fits and starts, a testament to the peculiar stubbornness of ecological wrongs and to the forms of human resilience that insist upon making right, even when rightness comes slowly. The chemical rain that fell decades ago did not stop at the borders of battlefields. Its consequences have threaded through the lives of veterans, civilians and landscapes in ways that modern systems of justice and medicine still struggle to account for. Litigation brought a measure of relief, policy created frameworks for compensation, and grassroots campaigns pressed the matter into public conscience. Remediation offers tools, each with costs and limits, to manage and sometimes remove contamination, but the hard work of deciding where and how to apply those tools requires more than technology. It requires political will, long-term funding, and the patient listening that no court can mandate. The story is not over. It is, like many such stories, a long and careful choreography of law, science, and human persistence, a choreography that moves, sometimes clumsily, toward a world in which the rain that once seemed unstoppable finally becomes a memory recorded, studied, cleaned, and perhaps one day left only as a lesson in the archives of human error. The pictures hang like a slow accusation, glossy and glassed, their colours muted by years of humidity and cigarette smoke that once hung in the same rooms where people came to read and to remember. There are rows of small plastic sandals painted white that sit beneath a photograph of a child shown in profile, the photograph taken in a morning that smells of dust and jasmine, and there is a placard that names a county, a hamlet, an airstrip and a date. The War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City still keeps these things, has kept them since 1975 when the building first opened, then as the exhibition house for US and puppet crimes, later renamed and restaged so that the images would not be static evidence but a continuing conversation. Visitors who come in July, the month when the heat turns the city's pavements into slow honey, look at the rows of prostheses like a winter of white branches and read the captions that point simply to cause and effect, the chemical, the barrel, the spray pattern, the air base. Behind those captions is logistics. Behind logistics is policy. Behind policy is an arithmetic that began in earnest between 1962 and 1971, when Operation Ranch Hand sprayed roughly 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, an amount often cited with a bluntness that still shocks. perhaps 11 million gallons of the mixture known to many as Agent Orange, named for the orange stripe painted around its barrels. Memory in Vietnam is not one thing, it is several things stacked together. State museums that frame Agent Orange as an American war crime. Village shrines where mothers light incense on behalf of children who will not have children. The slow bureaucratic record kept by the Ministry of Labour, Invalids and Social Affairs. Academic studies done in Hanoi and at provincial hospitals that try to count malformations and cancers and pattern them across generations. Cultural production has had to invent ways to make the invisible visible. Dioxin, 2,378 tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, or TCDD, does not photograph itself. It does not have a face. It leaves nothing that is picturesque. So artists, filmmakers, photographers and survivors' testimonies have had to work with the things that dioxin does leave behind. Landscapes stripped of canopies, a child's empty shoes arranged like a small surrender, the index of names that the War Remnants Museum keeps on a blackboard for visitors who cannot imagine the scale. These are the instruments of remembrance. In villages where Agent Orange touched soil and blood, memory is sensory. There is the odour of fish sauce, there is the blind, slow growth of mango trees that never quite bear well, there is the sound of a small body coughing in the night, and the rhythm of a family member's foot as they walk to the clinic. In city museums, the choreography is different. Artifacts are cured ball, captions supplied, narratives constructed so that a visiting French diplomat or a college student from Seoul will come away with a takeaway that is both emotionally legible and politically coherent. That coherence, though, is never singular. Competing narratives swirl. The Vietnamese state insists on responsibility. The United States used chemical agents in a pattern and magnitude that produced harm on a generational scale, and therefore owes restitution. Much of the international diaspora, from the Vietnamese community in France to groups in California and Australia, have made similar claims but from different angles. Some insist on legal liability, some on compensation, some on moral acknowledgement. In the United States, the story of Agent Orange has been mediated through the experience of veterans, the man who returned with chloroquine, the soldier who later developed cancer, the families whose claim for benefits turns on presumptions and epidemiology, and through a politics that has often been defensive, reluctant to reconcile causation and command. The artists and chroniclers who have bridged these divides are as various as the wounds they name. Fred A. Wilcox wrote a meticulous, determined book whose title, Agent Orange, Collateral Damage in Vietnam, tried plainly to name both the material and ethical fallout. Nick Terse, whose broader work on violence in Vietnam insists on the logistical absurdities of modern counterinsurgency, made the defoliation program look less like an antiseptic tactical choice and more like a massive industrial experiment with human and ecological side effects. Vietnamese-American memoirists such as Thi Bui in The Best We Could Do, 2017, carry that memory into the household, into parenthood and nourishment, and the small hazards of infancy, so that the chemical rain becomes a domestic legacy, one that moves from the map into the crib. Photograph books and exhibition catalogues have altered the public's capacity to care. Sometimes a single image will puncture the distance that statistics attempt to preserve. A photograph of a defoliated valley, taken from the Air Force's own reconnaissance slides in the late 1960s and later repurposed by anti-war activists, insists that a landscape can be a witness. Survivor testimony has been both a humanizing force and a political instrument. The mothers and fathers who speak, the veterans who testify in congressional hearings in Washington or in courts in Paris, are not just witnesses, they are interpreters who translate exposure into narratives of family, livelihood and loss. One of the most extraordinary and visible translators has been Tran Ton Nga, a Vietnamese woman who settled in France and decades after the spraying brought suit in French courts against multinational chemical manufacturers including Monsanto and Dow. Her suit, filed in 2014, refused to be quieted by the jurisdictional contortions that had protected corporate power in earlier decades. Her voice, like others, is both plaint and prosecution. It insists that memory can be evidence if the law will let it speak. The French court's willingness to hear her case made an international spectacle of what had for too long been treated domestically. It also showed how memory travels, from a hamlet in southern Vietnam to the courthouse in Paris, carried along by a life lived half under the shadow of war and half in exile. monuments have been erected with the same double intention, to remember and to instruct. Near schools and town halls in the Mekong Delta, small memorials and plaques mark villages as contaminated zones, name local sons and daughters who bore the burden, and provide a kind of municipal record, an archive of harm. In the United States, the memorialization looked different. The National Vietnam Veterans Memorial, completed in 1982 in Washington, D.C., does not speak of defoliation programs. Instead, its black granite speaks to those who died in combat and to those who were wounded in body and mind. Many veterans, however, did not see themselves reflected in the glory of that wall. They saw instead the slow bureaucratic fight for health benefits, the years of adjudication required to prove that a diagnosis might be linked to a chemical exposure a quarter-century earlier. Between these two forms of remembering, the public monument and the administrative file, there is a tension. The file can be dry, but it is actionable. The monument can indict, but rarely issues orders. Representations in film and television have been powerful precisely because they have had to invent a vocabulary for something that was not, in conventional wartime terms, visible. In American cinema, the Vietnam War found its archetypes earlier. Apocalypse Now in 1979, Platoon 1986, Full Metal Jacket in 1987, films that dramatized the moral and psychological disarray of counterinsurgency. Only later did cameras and cameras' successors turn to long-term exposures, to the rust-stained corrugations of water jars in rural Vietnam, to the slow work of mothers feeding children whose bodies do not respond in the expected ways. Documentary filmmakers from both sides of the ocean have made the case that images can produce empathy and, more importantly, pressure. Pressure on governments to fund health services, pressure on corporations to accept responsibility, pressure on courts to hear claims that had been dismissed on procedural grounds in the 1980s. The story of Agent Orange has been told often through the lens of legal failure. In 1984, in federal courts in the United States, several chemical companies agreed to a settlement in which roughly $80 million would be paid to US veterans and their families, a settlement that did not extend to Vietnamese plaintiffs and that left many frustrated with the limits of legal redress. That settlement closed one chapter but left another open. Memory as a contest for narrative authority and for the right to name the future of a landscape. In Vietnam, exhibitions and public pedagogy insist on the link between policy and harm. In the United States, official statements have tended to emphasize the complexity of causal inference and the need for scientific certainty before admitting legal responsibility. That cautious politics is not, in the end, an argument about whether a chemical can harm life. It is an argument about sovereignty, liability, and the distribution of moral costs across decades. The museums insist on names and places because names and places make futures. The courts insist on proof because proof costs money. The families insist on both. If the cultural work around Agent Orange pushed a moral conscience, the legal developments that followed the war pushed the law to notice that weapons could be environmental as well as human. The historical frame is plain. When the Geneva Protocol of 1925 forbade the use of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases, the drafters had in mind the mustard and chlorine of the First World War and not the herbicidal cocktails mixed for jungle warfare 3 decades later. The US argued, defensibly within the narrow terms of the law as it stood at the time, that herbicides were not chemical weapons aimed at killing people, but military tools for denying cover. That is a legal argument and a strategic one, and both had consequences. The perceived legal lacuna pushed states to act. In the 70s, the United Nations and many states took a new interest in environmental modification as a category of weapons, and in 1997, the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or Any Other Hostile Use of Environmental Modification Techniques, (ENMOD), sought to close the gap by banning techniques that would have widespread, long-lasting or severe consequences. Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, adopted in the same era, for the first time offered explicit protection to the natural environment in armed conflict by forbidding means and methods of warfare expected to cause long-term widespread damage. These steps were attempts to fit new kinds of harm into older moral frameworks, but lawmaking is necessarily slow and awkward, bound to the states that still want to be able to fight. The Chemical Weapons Convention, negotiated in the 1990s and entering into force in 1997, made a comprehensive prohibition of chemical weapons and created verification regimes that are rigorous, except for a crucial semantic slippage. The CWC is focused on chemicals intended for use as weapons, those designed to kill, injure, or incapacitate people. A herbicide, if used to remove crops or foliage, does not immediately fall into the neat category the CWC polices. The Convention helps regulate toxic industrial chemicals and proscribes their use as weapons, and yet it left open the question of when an herbicide, applied at scale and with toxic contaminants like TCDD present, crosses the line into deliberate human harm. Rome Statute jurisprudence, the work of the International Criminal Court, has in recent decades taken steps to classify widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment as a possible war crime when it is plainly excessive in relation to military advantage. That principle matters for the ethics of defoliation. It was written against the grain of Vietnam. The Rome Statute was adopted in 1998 and entered into force in 2002. It came too late to adjudicate the era of Agent Orange, but its language shows the world rethinking what constitutes an unacceptable cost of war. Those rethought categories have, in turn, provoked an ethical and political conversation about what belongs in a courtroom, what belongs in a museum, and what belongs in a communal apology. The movement to recognise ecocide as an international crime, championed in public by activists such as Polly Higgins and taken up by legal scholars and some policymakers, tries to create a category that would sit alongside genocide and crimes against humanity. If the concept of ecocide had been law in 1968 or 1970, would we have had a clearer mechanism to hold states to account for Agent Orange? Perhaps, perhaps not. The law is not a mirror that simply reflects moral truth. It is a technology that orders responsibility in time and space. It can name harm and allocate sanctions. It can also, if ill-designed, allow parties to shuffle moral costs into the hands of those least able to pay. If the law was slow, the scientists were methodical, and the tension between science and politics became a theatre of its own. Beginning with the early toxicological studies in the 70s, and extending through the work of the World Health Organization and the International Agency for Research on Cancer, public health bodies gradually assembled evidence that TCDD is an extraordinarily dangerous molecule. In 1990, IARC classified TCDD as a Group 1 carcinogen, carcinogenic to humans. That categorization did not end debates about specific diseases and about the scale of congenital effects across generations, because epidemiology is a patient form of proof. You need cohorts, controls, and time. The Institute of Medicine and the US National Academies produced a series of reports from the 1990s onward, careful, often cautious statements that established certain associations, chloracne, some cancers, type 2 diabetes among others, and left other links ambiguous because of confounding factors and insufficient exposure data. Exposure matrices were imperfect. Serum TCDD levels can tell you something about an individual's exposure at a point in time, but they do not easily tell you the cascade of epigenetic alterations in germlines, nor the full social and economic cost that exposure inflicts across decades. Science could tell that the molecule persisted in soil and in fat. It could not, with precision, attribute every childhood deformity in a single village to a single exposure event. And so the legacy of Agent Orange is an entanglement of scientific uncertainty and undeniable human need. The greatest hotspots of contamination, Bien Hoa with its airbase and storage facilities and the Da Nang airbase, came logistical faute for remediation because the military supply chain concentrates wastes in nodes and those nodes are legible. The US and Vietnam have cooperated on cleanup in a way that would have been unimaginable in the 1970s. The two governments began technical discussions in earnest after normalization of relations in 1995, and by the 2010s they had set up collaborative remediation projects. Da Nang has perhaps become the emblematic case. US-funded efforts used thermal desorption technology to excavate and treat soils contaminated with dioxin, a technology that heats soil to release and then destroy organic contaminants at high temperatures. The work is expensive, slow, and subject to local protest, and even successful remediation cannot erase the historical fact of release. Bien Hoa is harder because contamination sits deeper, and groundwater systems sneeze the toxin across landscapes. Cleanup can redistribute pollutants. It can also decouple community memory from the land that created it. There will always be places where the soil remembers better than the government wants, where a village will keep a nameless list. Scientific research in future must be interdisciplinary, patient and ethically grounded. We need longitudinal cohort studies that follow exposed families across generations, with careful attention to social as well as biological markers. We need biomarkers that are reliable and accessible, ways to tell a family in a Mekong hamlet whether the effects they see in their children are statistically linked to parental exposures. We need environmental monitoring that maps soil and sediment contamination with precision, and social science that asks how stigma, poverty and educational access mediate outcomes. Above all, we need to build institutional capacity in Vietnam, laboratories, registries, training, so that the work of documenting and treating the exposure and harm can be locally led and globally supported. Justice is not only scientific or juridical, it is also medical, social and symbolic. Medical justice means clinics, access to prosthetics, genetic counselling, long-term care for chronic diseases. Social justice means pensions, disability benefits, education for affected children, and employment programs that allow families to be less dependent on uncertain incomes. Symbolic justice means memorials that include names, acknowledgement by offending parties, and public pedagogy that resists both erasure and simplification. The US government has moved in some ways toward material remediation and assistance in cooperation with Vietnam, but Washington has also resisted litigative responsibility, and multinational corporations have largely closed their legal chapters after the settlements of the 1980s and the dismissal of suits by Vietnamese plaintiffs in US courts. That gap between assistance and admission matters. It is the moral crevasse that turns acts of charity into instruments of selective amnesia. The persistence of transnational responsibility is also a political question. Who bears the cost of restoration and care, and on what basis? Is it states that wage wars, corporations that profit from production, or international institutions that might, in theory, create a pooled fund for remediation? The United Nations Environment Programme has offered frameworks for environmental remediation after conflict but lacks enforcement power. The World Bank can fund programs but is reluctant to be a court of justice. Civil society has tried to bridge the gulf. The Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange, VAVA, and other groups demand reparations and coordinate services. International NGOs have raised funds and provided medical support. Lawyers have tried new venues, French courts, international human rights forums, to overcome jurisdictional obstacles. The struggle is as much about the architecture of global justice as it is about specific dollars spent on cleanup. Looking forward, the priorities are painfully practical. First, science. Build registries, fund cohort studies, support local laboratories, share data transparently, and invest in technologies that can map and remove dioxin safely. Thermal desorption where feasible, containment where necessary, and permanent monitoring stations where cleanup is impossible. Second, victim support. Design social programs that treat exposure as an ongoing public health crisis, education stipends, disability pensions, psychosocial services, and vocational programs that are culturally appropriate. Third, reparative diplomacy. Maintain an honest bilateral dialogue between Hanoi and Washington that keeps the needs of affected communities central, insists on measurable outcomes, and refuses to substitute tokenism for systemic change. Fourth, legal innovation. Pursue corporate accountability where possible, but also consider new international mechanisms, funded, independent and victim-centred, that can allocate responsibility without requiring the broken-through jurisprudence of domestic courts. And reconciliation. Reconciliation is not finally a forgetting. It is a careful acknowledging together of what happened and why. It will require public narratives that include the messy truth, the operational rationale for the herbicidal program, the military logs, the corporate contracts, the storage maps that place toxic wastes beside airstrips and wells. It will require education systems that teach the full chronology and the ethical questions, not just the sanitized versions that comfort or inflame. It will require ceremonies that include apology where possible and meaningful material commitments where apology is insufficient. There is no simple formula. There are only practical choices: investing in community health, funding university partnerships, supporting local memorials that are co-designed with victims, and ensuring that any future technologies deployed in conflict zones are subject to more rigorous legal and ethical scrutiny than the herbicides that rained down between 1962 and 1971. The story of Agent Orange is a story of scale. The scale of barrels and spray runs and the logistics that made them possible. The scale of the affected population. The scale of the cleanup budget. The scale of centuries required for some molecules to decay. It is also a story of small human things, a photograph, a child's shoe, a mother's testimony in a courtroom in Paris, the slow heat of thermal desorption units in Da Nang. To approach this legacy responsibly is to hold both registers at once, to count the gallons and to listen to the voices, to fund remediation and to curate memory, to pursue law and to provide care. There is dark humour of the blackest kind in how the planners once spoke of denuding jungles as part of a tidy military calculus, how they imagined that visibility would equal victory, and in how later bureaucrats measured remediation in tons of excavated soil. Denuding in a room of planners reads like a neat engineering problem. Outside in the Mekong, the land continued to respond according to a different logic. In bodies, in births, in fruit trees that failed to ripen. The dioxin did what dioxin does. It lingered. It bound itself to sediments. It entered tissues. It waited. The law caught up with some of the questions. Science caught up with others. Both left parts of the puzzle unresolved. The road ahead is long. It winds through laboratories and courtrooms and provincial clinics, through museum halls and village shrines, through classrooms and diplomatic cable offices. The moral contour of that road is made of small choices: what research we fund, which victims we prioritise for care, how we remember in school textbooks, whether we make corporate responsibility a central pillar rather than an afterthought. The pragmatic contour is made of budgets and technology. How many thermal desorption units, where to store the treated soil, how to monitor groundwater for the next generation. Both contours require a kind of patient courage that is rare in politics, a willingness to act not for a sentence of headlines, but for the decades needed to heal. If memory has taught us anything, it is this. The chemicals taught us that wars do not finish when the last bullet is fired. They taught us that policies have half-lives and that institutions must learn to carry cost forward, not just to erase the ledger when the cameras leave. The cultural work, the museums, the films, the books, the images, the lawsuits, the mother's testimony, has humanized the distant ledger of strategy and logistics. It has insisted that the numbers represent lives and that the lives demand more than numbers in return. Science has provided the method for separating coincidence from pattern. The law has provided some means for allocating responsibility. Diplomacy has provided some cooperation for remediation. None of them is complete. So the future must be stitched from all of it. Memory that refuses to be simplified. Legal forums that are creative when courts are closed. Scientific study that is long and patient. Remediation that is thorough and transparent. Social programs that are resilient. And a moral vocabulary that can hold both the unsayable sorrow and the steady small steps of repair. It is a slow work. It will not be finished in one generation. But if there is one practical ethic the Agent Orange story bequeaths, it is this. To confront a technological harm is to undertake a lifetime of response. Not a momentary apology and a press release, but a sustained commitment to research, remediation, and the dignity of those who must live with the harvest of decisions made by others long ago. The rain stopped falling in 1971. The killing did not stop. The memory work and the cleanup must continue, patient as the soil, relentless as a tide.